Can it really be the last day of Summerfest already? Bring on State Fair. I'm Charlie Sykes. Sunday Insight starts right now. Good morning and welcome to Sunday Insight. In the week that was, America celebrates its birthday. President Obama announces plans for a new embassy in Cuba and plans to expand overtime. He comes here to Wisconsin. More of Hillary Clinton's emails get released. Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, who's challenging Hillary, comes to Madison and draws a huge crowd. Chris Christie cannonballs into the crowded presidential campaign. Scott Walker is getting set to make his own dive next week in Waukesha. Closer to home, Milwaukee's homicide rate explodes to double the rate of last year, and bus drivers go on strike in the middle of Summerfest. But we start with the deal on the state budget, or make that sort of a deal. Republican Senate Leader Scott Fitzgerald admits he still doesn't have the votes to pass that spending plan, and there may be some speed bumps along the way to passage. But there was movement, an agreement on a transportation plan that cuts borrowing from $1.3 billion to $850 million, and would not delay work that has already begun in the Zoo interchange. Two other contentious issues. The Bucks Arena and reform of the prevailing wage law will be voted on separately outside the budget. That move means that Democrat votes will be needed for the Bucks deal, and it sets up a potentially interesting scenario on the Depression-era prevailing wage law next Wednesday. The State Assembly will take up proposals to repeal that law requiring public projects pay union-level wages set by state bureaucrats. On Wednesday, the Assembly will take up several competing prevailing wage proposals. Lobbyists close to Speaker Robin Vos already are scrambling to make sure the Assembly passes something that might not be able to pass the Senate. Well, here's the trick. If there's no reform of the wage law, Fitzgerald may not be able to pass the full budget, so this could be interesting. Joining me on our panel this morning, defense attorney Dan Adams, the managing editor of WriteWisconsin.com, Colin Roth, and political strategist Lynn DeBruin. So, Colin, you have been watching all of this. There are several different scenarios. Am I right, first of all, in saying that if there's not prevailing wage reform, you're not going to be able to get a budget passed?
That's right. We heard.
So
there are now 3 Republican senators who have made their budget vote incumbent on getting some level of significant repeal or reform.
Okay, so we have Dewey Strobel, we have Steve Noss, and then we have Frank Lassay. They will vote no. So what are the prospects? The Assembly has been a holdout. Robin Vos has basically blocked any sort of reform up until now. What's going to happen when this comes to the floor?
Well, I'm surprised it's going with the Assembly first. I thought a lot of us thought it would go through the Senate first, because that was kind of the excuse we'd heard all along from Speaker Vos. But this ball has moved forward drastically, I think. Last week we saw an Assembly proposal that was a very weak and tweak reform to the prevailing wage, something that a lot of conservatives weren't impressed by. And then by Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday of last week, we saw a very serious and substantial reform coming from the Senate from Senator Frank Lassay. That is what is going to be coming up in the Assembly, and that's where it could get interesting.
I mean, it could ping pong back and forth. Okay, so the removal of the Bucks Stadium, we've been talking about this for several weeks. It is out of the budget. It will require Democrat votes. Senator Fitzgerald says he will absolutely not pass in the Senate unless you have Milwaukee Democrats who vote for it. Will Milwaukee Democrats vote for this Bucks Arena deal? Linda Bruin.
Well, who knows what shenanigans they'll all come up with in the next few days or week or whatever. But I think as of today, I don't think so.
You don't think so?
I don't think so.
Okay, what do you think, Dan Adams?
You
hang out with these guys.
Well, I'm kind of a pessimist as to this course of action. What I think is really interesting about the state budget is that we hadn't heard anything out in the open for about 30 days. I mean, there hadn't been a joint finance meeting in 30 days. They come out and you think, okay, they're going to have a ribbon tied around this thing. It's going to be done. And Senator Fitzgerald pretty much kind of sheepishly says, well, I don't know if this one's going to pass yet. So, we've got this timetable of Governor Walker, who promised that the thing was going to be done before he starts his official presidential bid. It's not going to happen. He on Thursday, he filed his papers. So there's this incredible crunch, and there really still isn't 100% certainty that a budget's
Well, I mean, and of course, it could get messy. I mean, if there are games played. So let me give you an example on going back to prevailing wage. So let's say that the Assembly passes, wants to make some mischief. They could, of course, pass the Frank Lassay compromise, which looks like it will pass both houses of the legislature. Or they could say, hey, you know what? We'll pass a full repeal, and then we'll dare the Senate to do something, right? I mean,
yeah, and then you could see the Senate pass the Lassay plan, and you could see some ping-ponging back and forth.
I'm speaking of ping-ponging back and forth. So why do you think that no Democrats are going to vote for the Bucks Arena deal? It's in their town. It's in their city.
I think they don't think it's a good deal. I'm not saying that no Democrats will vote for it. I just don't think enough will vote for it that it'll pass.
I wonder how many.
I don't think they want ownership of this, I guess, is the bottom line.
Well, when I talked to Senator Fitzgerald, he didn't specify how many votes. It sounds to me, I kind of get the sense that if you got 2 votes, that it might be enough to be able to pass this. Well, let me just ask you this. It's kind of an interesting. So the big contracts last week, in a 2-day period, the Milwaukee Bucks handed out $150 million in contracts to 2 guys. Does that help sell the Bucks deal? Does it hurt the Bucks deal? Is it irrelevant?
The sale would have been to trade for a top draft pick and gotten Frank Kaminsky on the team. That didn't happen. There is something that offends, I think, a lot of Democrats in town about these billionaires from New York coming and asking for public monies. I get that, but they better vote for it because this is a huge economic stimulus for the entire region, but most importantly, the city of Milwaukee.
Yeah, but again, the part of this, the optics here. Now, I understand that the argument is, well, you're having these huge contracts. It's an argument in favor of the Bucks Arena deal because these guys are paying all these income taxes, and therefore, it somehow is going to pay its way. Except it's not really going to pay its way.
It also highlights the whole economic disparity between the wealthy owners and the wealthy players and the average Milwaukee resident.
But
and that's what Democrats respond to.
But they should be focused on growth, not differences.
Okay, what has your glass half full? What has your glass half empty this week? We'll go around the table. Dan Adams, you're first.
Well, on this topic, my glass is half full because Milwaukee's Democratic legislators have gained some relevancy, clout, and responsibility with the Bucks Arena bill being pulled out of the budget. In pursuit of a separate bill, my glass is half empty because pulling the arena financing from the budget, chances of the Bucks deal passing is very much in doubt. Outstate Republicans will flee the project, and I'm pessimistic there are enough Democratic votes here to save it.
Colin Roth.
My glass is half full because we're on the goal line of getting very meaningful prevailing wage repeal and reform. It's half empty because even with historic Republican majorities in the legislature and a conservative governor running for president, getting this pro-taxpayer reform across the finish line has been very, very difficult.
Linda Bruin.
Well, my glass is half full because Donald Trump's racist comments 2 weeks ago caused many companies to cut ties with him. And it's funny that Trump piñatas are selling quite well in Mexico. Apparently, a lot of Mexicans want to hit the guy. But my glass is half empty because last week Trump made things even worse by ramping up his racist rhetoric and filing a massive lawsuit against Univision.
Yeah. Well, my glass is half full because the unemployment rate nationally dropped to 5.3% last week. My glass is half empty because the labor participation rate, the number of people actually in the workforce, dropped to 62.6%, the lowest percentage since 1977 when Jimmy Carter was president. Next on Sunday Insight, bus drivers go on strike. What good did it do? On strike, or maybe it's just a job action, whatever you want to call it, the union representing transit workers walked off the job last week for 72 hours, shutting down all bus service from Wednesday until early Saturday morning. The key sticking point seems to be the bus company's plans to hire some part-time drivers, a move the union opposes. The union insists the strike is not about money, but the bus company points out the average driver makes more than $62,000 a year in salary and overtime, and the union was asking for $8 million in increased wages. That strike left tens of thousands of bus riders scrambling to find alternatives and came during the busiest days of the city's biggest festival. Was this a good idea, Linda Bruin, as a former county supervisor?
And someone who believes in unions and their ability to strike, the answer to that is no.
Really?
10 years ago.
No big blue fist from you?
No, 10 years, because they haven't made a good case for why they needed to do it. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, the average Milwaukee citizen would have been behind a strike, even a rare strike, or even a long-term strike if they felt, because they were so pro-union. But the political sentiment or public sentiment has really changed. And if a union is going to strike now in this political environment, they have to be able to make a good case for it, and they haven't.
Okay, Colin.
Yeah, I agree. The attempt to villainize Chris Abley or the county has not succeeded, and I think this is going to make a lot of people angry and unhappy, and a lot of people who depend on public transportation to get to jobs, appointments, church, whatever. But I also think there's a lot of people making money off this. Look no further than Uber.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is very different than the average strike, which is aimed at making it inconvenient for the bosses, for the management, for the owners of a private company. In this particular case, case. This was so obviously a strike against the public interest, public safety, and the people who were affected were the most vulnerable, the people who were trying to get to minimum wage jobs or trying to get to their hospital, doctor's appointments. So you have folks who are making more than $60,000 a year striking at the expense of just average working people.
Well, you're right on all counts there. I mean, being a Milwaukee County bus driver is a terrible job. I mean, they get hit and slapped and spit on. You know, it's just a job I would never want. Right. But they make a middle class good living. And for people in my and Colin's generation, you know, we don't know people that are in unions. I mean, in 1978, the last time there was a bus strike, a full quarter of Milwaukeeans were in some type of union. Right now, in private sector unions are about 8% nationwide. So there's not a lot of empathy from young people to say, hey, you're making a middle class job, you don't like the conditions, they're not ideal, and you're just going to leave us all on
and also they went on strike against fun. I mean, in their mind, they thought, hey, let's attack the most popular festival, one of the busiest times of the entire year, because that'll make people support us. What about the role of County Supervisor Johnny Weishawn? Dan Bice had a column last week suggesting that he had advised them, go ahead, go out on strike, do a blue flu. He's supposed to be a county supervisor, and he's telling the union to go out and strike against his constituents. How does that work?
Well, it's kind of interesting because this is the union negotiates with a company that's separate from Milwaukee County, and Milwaukee County has a contract with a company. So technically, Weishawn is not violating any county ethics laws or anything. Not technically. But if the memory of the union person that he talked to when he wrote up the actual memo, if that memo is accurate, which, you know, I think to have to be fair to Weishawn says that's not accurate. But if it is, then Weishawn really is interfering in that contract negotiations process.
You know, and again, you do have a public interest here.
Who does he represent? He represents the special interests that pay for his campaigns, who may give him a job when the county board is downsized to a part-time position. I just don't buy it.
He also represents union workers in West Dallas. I mean, a lot of his constituents are union workers as well.
But there are far more people who are inconvenienced than people who are on that picket line. Now, you may not want to hear it, but we will tell you anyway. Let's hand out some unsolicited advice. Dan Adams, you're first.
To Republicans, including most of those running for president, don't double down on your opposition to gay marriage. What votes could you possibly gain, net gain, from digging in your heels on this? Move on.
Colin Roth.
Well, on a similar note, my advice is for those celebrating the victory of same-sex marriage, avoid turning your sights on the church and religious liberty. You've won, but vanquishing dissenters will not end well for our free and civil society.
Linda Bruin.
Well, I wouldn't mind driving 2 hours each day to get my daughter to work during the bus strike if the union would make a compelling case for why they need to strike. But so far they haven't, and unless they do, this strike will be a lose-lose situation, weakening their negotiating position and further eroding public support for all unions.
Well, my advice is to President Obama, if you want to increase middle-class wages like you say you do, stop the edicts, the mandates, the regulations, and the higher taxes. They didn't work for Greece, and they won't work for us. Next on Sunday Insight, the summer gets off to a bloody start in Milwaukee. Is it time to change police chiefs? Milwaukee's bloody year gets bloodier. Last week, Milwaukee hit a grim milestone. The 74 murders in the first 6 months of the year was double the number of victims in the first 6 months of last year and nearly double the numbers of victims in the first half of each of the preceding 4 years. The upswing in violence comes as the city's Fire and Police Commission was deciding whether to extend Police Chief Ed Flynn's contract for a third 4-year term. But let's just step back. Dan Adams, what's going wrong here? Why would you have such a dramatic increase here in Milwaukee?
It's not explained. I've asked DAs and police what's going on here. There's no real clear explanation. And frankly, there's a lot of blame to go around. But I think the people we should be looking at are the same people who take the praise when there's a big arrest, when there's a big conviction. The police chief and John Chisholm. This is the other end of being an accountable public official in the criminal justice space. And frankly, Chief Flynn has been in office since 2008. Yeah. He has cut the detective squad from about 250 detectives to about 180. That means there's less trained detectives getting confessions on big cases, doing long-term investigations, arresting full groups of antisocial people. That's on him. So at this point, I think the mayor and Chief Flynn have to be held accountable.
Well, I would hold the mayor more accountable than that. I'm not going to be as hard on Chief Flynn as you were, but you did mention the DA, John Chisholm, here, and I had a piece this last week. Look, John Chisholm is in the middle of an experiment. He was featured in New Yorker magazine, Milwaukee's Experiment, talking about his new approach for diverting people from prison, because he has put racial justice and his fight against mass incarceration ahead of public safety. So he has developed a specific philosophy of trying to avoid putting people behind bars. And I think what you're seeing is the fact that this experiment is failing and the body count is rising, because in each and every case that we see one of these horrendous crimes, you find out they had a very, very long rap sheet. And you raise the question, why were they plea bargained out? Why did liberal judges let them out on the street? So I do think that there is a cause and effect, that you have John Chisholm's new experiment, and then in 1 year, the murder rate ticks up by 100%. Colorado?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Charlie. We've seen it time and time again in all these high-profile cases. When the suspect is finally arrested or identified, they have a long, long rap sheet, and it's often found that they haven't served their full time or nearly close to the full sentence. But we also have to accept the complexity of what happens in a big city. We also there are different factors, from poverty to culture.
Yeah. Well, I agree with part of what all of you said, but I do think you have to look at the bigger picture. Violent crime and murder rates are popping up all over the country. Baltimore, Atlanta, Houston, Chicago, Los Angeles, St. Louis, New York City.
Right.
And so there's this national phenomenon. 2014 was like the last year of 20 years of declines.
Yeah, but
why? And they're saying that in each city there's different primary reasons. In New York City, there was a discrimination case that changed how they frisk people, so they're blaming that. In St. Louis, they're blaming zones of murders with gangs. What do you blame here?
Well, also,
is it
you do have this
our high unemployment rate?
Well, how about the anti-police rhetoric that we went through? We went through an orgy of cops killing young black men, and there was a huge pushback. In Milwaukee, we had a cop who was fired for, I think, really doing his job. He was exonerated. In other cities, in fact, you've had the mayors make it very, very clear that they were going to break bad on the cops. So I think that what you're also seeing in a lot of these cities is a pullback from law enforcement doing some of the kinds of aggressive, proactive law enforcement that they had done in the past, and I think you're also seeing consequences from that.
I don't buy that, Charlie, and here's why. Chief Flynn has been a broken windows guy. He wants cops in the street engaging with the community at the expense of the long-term investigations. And when I talk to people, it's that component. It's the trade-off that's coming
I will tell you
here.
that there are cops who now are thinking, if I do policing the way I used to, am I going to get fired? Am I going to get charged? Am I going to get second guessed? So what is it you don't get this week? Let's go around the table again. Dan Adams, you're first.
I don't get why my Congresswoman Gwen Moore hasn't signed on to a new bipartisan bill to reform the federal criminal justice system proposed by Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner. The bill allows low-level, nonviolent drug offenders to avoid harsh mandatory sentences, which is a big step in the right direction.
Colin Roth.
What I don't get is why the New York Times felt so safe in running the condom Pope image from the Milwaukee Art Museum, but not the controversial Charlie Hebdo covers. Then again, maybe I do get it.
Linda Bruin.
Well, it isn't surprising that fringe candidates from both political parties, like Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, are running for president. But what I don't understand is Trump being in second place with Republicans and 10,000 Democrats attending Sanders' Madison speech. What is drawing so many voters to each party's fringe candidates?
You've got something about
I do.
Donald Trump. Well, okay, I agree with Colin Roth. I don't get why the New York Times refused to run any of the cartoons of Muhammad that resulted in the murder of the staffers of the French magazine Charlie Hebdo, but they have no problem running that picture of the Pope made out of condoms. Could it be because Catholics aren't beheading folks? Next on Sunday Inside, our panel picks the winners and losers of the week, but first, here's your morning news update. It is time for our panel to pick the winners and losers of the week. Dan Adams, for some reason, you're first again.
I like that. My winner this week is socialist Bernie Sanders, who is running for the Democratic nomination for president. I am not a Sanders guy, but he packed the Dane County Coliseum on Wednesday night with 10,000 supporters, probably the biggest rally of this 2016 election to date. Impressive. My loser is Milwaukee County Board Supervisor John Weishan, who callously orchestrated Milwaukee's bus strike that harmed our county's most vulnerable citizens, the working poor, the elderly and the disabled. Shame on you, John Weishon.
Colin Roth.
My winner this week is Cindy Archer, a former aide to Scott Walker, who announced a civil rights lawsuit against John Chisholm and the John Doe investigators to hold them personally liable for the violation of First and Fourth Amendment rights. This is big, and I wish you success. My loser is the Export-Import Bank, whose authority expired this week. This bank was a crony capitalist giveaway that gave taxpayer dollars to big business, and it was a nice victory for conservatives in Congress to see that authority lapse.
Linda Bruin.
Well, with unemployment falling to the lowest level in 7 years, Americans spending their discretionary dollars again, and many economists saying our economy has almost fully recovered from the Great Recession, my winners are the American economy and the Democratic president this recovery occurred under. My losers are the 6.5 million part-time workers who can't find full-time jobs, the record high number of people who've given up looking for work, and workers whose wages have gone down or not risen for years. These deficits have created a hole in the middle class that needs to be corrected.
You didn't mention the Democratic president in that section. Well, my loser is, I agree with Colin again, Milwaukee DA John Chisholm. His experiment is failing, and as Colin notes, he's now facing a civil rights lawsuit that could hold him personally liable. Even prosecutors need to be held accountable. Winners, Americans. Even with all of our differences and all of our problems, we are still here and still the last best hope for the world. Happy birthday, America, again. Thanks for joining us. Join me for my radio show Monday morning on News Radio 620 WTMJ from 8:30 until noon. Have a great week.